fact, an undercurrent of grief running through them. And, I was thinking the session might also have been titled Grief and the City. I want to ask you, did you consciously, unconsciously write these books as acts of grieving? Perhaps?
It's funny that you mentioned that, because when somebody was asking me to sum up what I wrote, and I did say it was grief, but I'll make this part really short and say that I think when it comes to grief, and this is a blanket statement, but I think we all process grief in so many different ways, but there's always this one moment of such explosive emotion where we've got nothing to lose. And I think that moment where you have nothing to lose, that's when you can make a lot of radical change. Something that's really, really terrifying change, or something that's really tragic, or something that's really powerful and positive. But there's that moment, and I think that's really an incendiary moment.
There is a wonderful line the German author Herta Müller says, and there's a namesake of her in my book. And that's a very, it's a line that kind of haunted me while I was writing the book. And it is that when I let myself a feeling, I dress up the part that hurts with a story. So the story as a bandage to dress a wound. So while there was grieving in the book, what I was always aware of was that each character, by telling a story, is also healing herself or himself. In fact, the entire story is in the mind of somebody. So yes, there is grief in the story. I was deeply aware of grief, but what kept me going was that process of healing, when that each word becomes a part of the bandage.
And grieving is the first step towards healing. It's when you grieve that you confront the sorrow and the brutality that you're grieving, and the loss that you're grieving about. And in fact, so in that process, both your books contain both very disturbing moments and disturbing characters. So Rheea, you have the young grieving widow Meera, and she strikes up a friendship that becomes increasingly strange friendship with Sarah and Rahil. And these are very intriguing characters. They are not always pleasant characters. They are often, in fact, actively unpleasant. They are often dishonest, both to themselves and to each other. They are often manipulative. And you, Raj, I mean, you have, your book is told, I wouldn't say narrated, but sort of told in the voices of, again, three characters. One is this young boy whose mother doesn't come home one evening, and he's looking for her. The other is, as it becomes clear through the book, the mother herself, who is, in a sort of dreamscape, in a coma, clearly. And the third and the most difficult is the character of December. And that character, you realize in the course of reading the book, is the juvenile accused in that rape, and so that again is a difficult choice to have chosen, this young man as somebody whose voice you will put on the page, and some terribly difficult moments come up. So I wanted to ask both of you, one, What does a writer gain from making their readers uncomfortable, as both of you do? And relatedly, what is it, and why should writers make themselves uncomfortable in the process of writing? Perhaps.
I mean, I want to comment on, December's character in Raj's book, because, it's from the perspective of, yes, someone who's capable of something, of brutal rape. And yet, for me, what Raj managed to do over there was to build the system around it. So you humanize a voice by saying, but what are these what are these contexts that create a person to grow up in this environment and support and sustain something like this. And so I think that is, and I think when it comes down to writing, this is the most important part, is that can we make ourselves uncomfortable by not trying to say, well, this is bad and this is good and I'm over here. Because once you understand how complicit we all are in creating these little systems, that's what makes us uncomfortable. That's why I read. That's why I want to write, because I feel there's this complicity in all of us. And we like to push it to one extreme and say, that's the bad, without having our hands in it. So,
yeah, I think Rheea has done a wonderful job framing the big picture on this. On should you make a reader uncomfortable, or are you uncomfortable? At the very personal level, and that's how when I write, and I think maybe this is a wrong forum to say this, but when I write, I am not the person you see on stage. I'm very, very different as a writer. I think all of us are. It's a very personal exercise. I don't speak to anybody, and in fact, in a way, writing is closer to thinking for me than to speaking. When I'm speaking now, I have something, I've worked out a few sentences, but when you write, you just go where you are going, where it takes you. There's a lot of gunk, there's a lot of dirt, there's a lot of mess that you wade into. There are stories that are lying there which it seems you have discovered. And it is a good editor who then tells you, is the discomfort worth it? Because that's a call that you can't take, because you are writing for yourself, you are your reader. So I don't know whether we consciously take a call that should I shock the reader or not. If it shocks you and you feel that you need to be shocked, it's there in the book. So that's one. The second was, I think, what Rheea said. We are not sociologists, we are not social scientists. When we are telling a story, it is just, there is something inside us, there's a need to tell a story. Now, where does that need come from? I don't know. I wish I never know. But that's, you're a writer, Parvati, all the kind of work that you have done, the fiction and the non-fiction, they come from the same author, but they seem to be coming from two very different places. Yeah.
Something about what both of you said just now reminded me of, the philosopher George Steiner. He was writing about very difficult subjects. He was talking specifically about the Holocaust, in fact, and he said, the aesthetic makes bearable. Because when you put things in a frame, the reader already is expecting a sort of story within a certain frame, and then they shut it out. They say, okay, this is a story, this is fiction. It's not. I can just sort of keep it at a distance. But in fact, both of you break that aesthetic, because and I think that's the shock. It's not just a schlock shock. It's a shock that makes the discomfort makes the reader appreciate the story as something that becomes more real than just fiction. And you have and also it seems as if in some ways these the uglinesses or the discomforts embody something of the corruption of not just some characters, but of the cities that they inhabit, or societies that they inhabit as a whole. And so I want to ask, and both of you have located your stories in cities, and the characters are all very well defined. The cities are anonymous, almost metaphorical. Why did you both decide to do that?
Well, one was a very simple reason. The zip code and the street names did not matter to me in the story. It was more a landscape inside the mind. So that is one simple reason. I did not feel the need to name streets and mention the city. That was one. But I think at the same time, these days we tend, our relationship with the city that we live in or the city where we go to is a very complex one. I think, whenever I see an airplane land in a city, the first thing people do is to switch on their phones. The phone book becomes your city, in a way. Google Maps and, when you share a car, when you call an Uber in a foreign city, it gives you this very deceptive sense of intimacy. That blue dot makes you feel that you know the city when you do not know it at all. You are sitting in a car, but now you know street names, you know where to turn left and right. But the entire experience is anonymous. So I think for me, in this story as well, the journey was almost like an Uber journey into the heart of darkness, where it doesn't matter whether you take a left turn or a right turn, and which street it is. What matters is the blue dot starting at home, and where does the blue dot end?
And you use the metaphor of the sea. So it's the city and the sea, and the sea keeps coming up. It's not necessarily physical sea. It's a kind of peripheral world that surrounds the city and is almost a sort of threat to it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that metaphor of the city versus the sea?
Yeah, because I think now more than ever, the time we spend with our screens is defining so many of our relationships with the physical city. In fact, whenever you board a cab or and you look at your map, have I reached the destination? What's on the left or right? If you just zoom out on your screen, it's the sea. It is the sea, but you're not. But it doesn't matter to you. So this constant living in a city where there is another city next to you, which you consciously avoid, was a very important part of my story.
And Rheea, you have a metaphor also of the rasagura fruit and of course the...
Yeah, so I have my city is a fictional name, which is Suryam, but I have a very a cop-out answer to this, and the reason is that because the city that I'm most familiar with in India is Bangalore, and I find Bangalore to be a very benign city to put in a book. It just does not work in my head. And I was trying so hard not to base this book in Bangalore that I said I'm gonna make a fictional city. I'm not going to call it Delhi. I'm not going to call it Bombay. And there was this insularity that I felt was there in the book when I was writing it. It's very like Meera, Sarah, Rahil, and that's the entire book. And there's this, and so even though that all Indian cities have this chaotic nature to it, which is this unsustainable irony that we're all living within. There's this, there was this super insularity with these three characters. So I thought that the name and a mythical fruit that grew in this city would somehow lend to that mythical quality. However, a lot of friends in Bangalore will come up to me now and say, why did you name it Suryam? It's so obvious it's Bangalore. So I guess like how people, and it's not maybe evident to other people who live outside Bangalore, but probably my friends who view the city, and like you were saying, in the same way, and we all view it according to the lens that we come from, our class, our bubbles that we live in, and you're taking in one perspective of the city, so it's no surprise that people who live with me, around me, are coming and saying, oh, I see the city for what it is.
Did you find it freeing in some way to not have to name the city? Did your characters change once they were not in
my
Bangalore?
Characters wouldn't have worked. Like when I was writing it, it wouldn't have worked if I named the city for some reason. Yeah.
So Rheea, to you again. So you have, like you're saying, that your book, your story, or the plot revolves around these three characters, and it revolves around the ideas of love. And the three characters experience a whole range of types of love in the course of the book. There's marital love, there's adulterous love, there's lesbian love, there's polyamorous love, and love is and has always been. One of the strongest impulses and strongest subjects for writers across time. Why particularly did you choose it? And did you find Why did you choose? Because the other thing that happens in your book is there's all these kinds of love, but you know, in the end, there's a kind of almost ascetic detachment. So what was what was that trajectory? How were you playing with that trajectory while writing or thinking about?
You know, when I was writing the book, I was going through a lot of my own spiritual questions. Personally, it was a very spiritual time for me, and I was trying to, you know, so there's this, you know, when people ask you, well, what is spirituality? People say something along the lines of being super attached to everything and not at all at the same time. And it sounds like, wait, it sounds like it makes sense, but what does that mean? And so I think that was the question I was trying to figure out. And like you said, love, why is love such a popular thing? Because I think it makes us impulsive, it makes us rethink, it makes us introspect, especially in a time right now where we are not introspecting and we are just driving out content. We are reacting to the world. We are just responding without taking in anything. We're not questioning the social paradigms we're brought up with. We're not questioning. We're in a constant state of responding, and I think it's exhausting. And I think love is that refuge where you can completely zone everything out and say, okay, I'm focused on this now. And therefore, this love is what is allowing me to re-question. And that's what they do. And what does re-questioning mean in a society that we're in? I think it's adulterous. I think it's marital. I think it's polyamorous. And these are all the other labels that you're going to get because it's deconstructing the whole notion of what you're living within.
Is it in a sense that love is the kind of force that gives you the courage to question things around you?
I agree.
It propels you in such a strong...
I think it's the only thing that could give you the courage to do something that is just completely something you never thought possible, you know? It brings people together, or it makes unlikely bonds, and that can happen on scale, and it can happen intimately.
And then why then do you end with detachment? Like, you know, you go from all these types of love and end with a kind of almost ascetic detachment.
Because I think because you know, and this is my own negotiation, because in the end, whatever you're loving or responding to, it's introspection, and introspection is something you take inward. And I think in the end, that's the only relationship you have is with yourself, constantly, as it evolves, but something that you're going to die with. And I think, so there's no real answer to the, like, can you be detached and attached at the same time to the world? You have to find that answer for yourself.
You have, Raj, a very different central emotion running through your book, and that is violence, and a sort of horrible violence, and not just, and in fact not much less the inflicting of violence. So it's not, it's not voyeuristic in that sense, but it's the creation of violence, and of how a society, a city, a culture creates these almost sociopathic, psychopathic types of violent behavior. And and I want to ask you, I mean, one, to talk a little bit about that, but also to ask whether, in the course of writing this, you thought about, in our present context now, how this vicious cycle of violence begetting violence can be broken.
Well, I'll steal from what Rheea said. I think in my book, more than violence, when I was writing, it is the absence of love. And I think at all levels, a mother's love, a spouse's love, a friend's love, and so on, just the absence of love makes the topsoil very fertile for violence. And you will have violence, that's one of the things I've learned by being a news editor for so many years, that, that these are stories that will always be there. Cities will always have violence. Families will always have violence, not just physical, but also psychological violence, which is more damaging, which you cannot legislate against. Because there are no wounds, there are no bruises, and yet you are very deeply hurt. And I think To me, the book was essentially a way to listen to stories of people we do not want to hear. Just that. It wasn't about what is cause and effect, which way the causality runs. Is this a symptom or is this a cause? I don't know. But to me, the attempt was, can we listen to those who we only hear about via the news pages or via interrogation statements? And yeah.
No, I mean, what you're saying about listening, there was, so again coming back to the character of the juvenile, I think it was maybe 3 years later, to December 2015, when there was a kind of legislation that was passed to reduce the age of juvenile offenders from 18 to 16. You know, and while I was, I mean, also from what you're saying, that this idea of listening and understanding where violence comes from. I was at a talk just maybe a couple of months ago, and we were talking. The talk was about crime and society and all of that. And you know, somebody said that England used to send all its criminals to Australia, and he said that, you know, we have so many islands in the Andamans, and why don't we send off our criminals there? And that, you know, that I guess, is that what you would mean by a society that does not listen? Is that?
No, I think, yeah. One is that obviously. The second is there is that violence inside each one of us, and it is easy to talk about stuff that is not that we are not involved with. But I think, you know, when you live in a country, one of the biggest social forces in India right now is just the huge number of young people. When you have almost 800 million under 35 and almost 500 million younger than them, and you cannot demonize what we, you know, by using labels like, say, sociopath or psycho. You know, we have to listen to these people. We have to understand them. We may not even understand them, but just the fact that the story needs to be told. And I think I just felt that need to tell that story. When that rape happened, by the way, you know, I was on a writing break in Berlin, and I had a son at that time who was 6 years old. At that time he was 6. And it struck me at that point, because when I was working on this book, a lot of the things I got to know was what was happening when he was 7 or 8 years old. And not that, you know, there's a major moral thing here, but that drew me to the story, that there is a kid. There are many kids out there, you know, and can we tell their stories?
And that is one of the contrasts, is the innocence of the one child and this sort of battered soul of the other, you know, and it's also, I mean, it's a question of society listening, sure, but also a question of structures that don't allow for, you know, two children growing up at the same time to grow up in the same way. You know, sort of a structured lack of love in our societies. So maybe moving on slightly, maybe I could ask you a little bit about your craft. You know, so you've written, Raj, your book is you know, it is I've said it's a sort of disturbing subject and disturbing characters, but you're a journalist in your day job, but your narrative style is the opposite of journalistic. You know, it has this sort of hallucinatory quality. Amitav Kumar, I think, has described it as your style as prose poems. And it's the kind of style that you know, could easily go wrong. Like if it's not handled well, it could fall flat. But you have this, you know, really taut momentum that keeps the reader transfixed to the page. I mean, I've read it twice, and each time more or less in one sitting. So, you know, people talk a lot about plot and storytelling in the writing of novels. Would you like to talk a little bit about narrative?
Well, you know, at one level, again, the story defined that form in this case, because in a way it needed to be fragmentary, hallucinatory, because it comes out of an anesthetic haze in the last days of somebody's life. So it needed that very disjointed storytelling, I thought. The second was, you know, yes, I spend most of my time in a newsroom where we have to focus on the 5 W's and the 1 H and what next, and we don't have space. And when I use fiction, it is essentially, you know, I normally kind of choose, or the subject chooses itself, in the sense that fiction is a tool to tell a story which my journalism cannot do. So I'm very deeply aware of it, that if I can do justice to a story via the newspaper, I will get reporters to do it. That's my job.
Right.
I'm paid to do that.
Right.
But there are certain stories which I feel it is very difficult to do justice to via a news story or a series. And then I start thinking of fiction. So I liberate myself. So journalism does inform my fiction, both in style and in the choice of story. But it also tells me that, you know, now what you're dealing with is what if. You're not dealing with what anymore. And so it gives you that space to do the things you said.
And Rheea, you go in the opposite direction in your narrative style. So you have a sort of consciously straightforward, you know, almost like you're sort of mimicking this. You know, these days newspapers, or not newspapers, but these online news headlines that they have these sort of abrupt, descriptive headlines. So you have headlines like that. For example, you have the one intimate thing Ketan told me before he died. You know, which creates this aura. And why did you choose this? What was your reason?
One part of it is that I always enjoyed books that kind of had this narrator that held your hand through something, and a lot of people do not like that. But I always enjoyed a story where the narrator had investment in the reader. No, you know, not always breaking the fourth wall per se, but, you know, in some way, somehow being conscious that somebody is invested in your story. But I think with this book, and the reason that it's so consistent, these headers and stuff, is because I think Meera essentially is very insecure about her story. And she, you know, she's using intellectualism to kind of cope with grief, with the fact of losing her husband at 30. And the subsequent crashing of all the other expectations that come with middle class, upper middle class Indian lifestyle. Because once something is, you know, taken off from the, you know, the carpet's taken away from your feet, you need a coping mechanism. And in the book, Meera has a mental breakdown, and, you know, she doesn't know how to handle her life anymore, so she sits and reads for a year and gets really into philosophy, something that she really wasn't, you know, brought up with particularly. And she starts to use a lot of these phrases and understandings of these worldviews from these French existentialists. And I think for me, while I was writing her, it was her using this, like, if I can just say some fancy things to people, then I'm coping with my grief. And if I can care less about how I feel. And I think that's the reason that, for me, the headlines in the book is like a way of showing Meera to the reader as somebody who's looking for validation, even though she thinks she's being very clever.
Like she's sort of trying to be very cut and dried, but
Yeah.
in order to hide her own fears.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And where did the philosophy come from? Where do you have an interest in
So that's-
philosophy, or is that
It's
something?
really funny because I went through this period. I mean, I have, yes, in theory, I have an interest in philosophy, but I didn't know much. And so I had to sit before I could write this book, I had to sit down for a couple of months and really research, like hours and hours of research. Thank God for the internet. And it's things that don't naturally stay in my head. Like if you ask me a few things from the book right now, I will not remember. I will not remember the context because I sat so heavily and researched at that time. And I think when you're doing research, you have to remember that your character is taking it in. So it can't just be vomited out like, oh, you read a bunch of stuff on philosophy and now you're just putting it in your book. And I think, and this is more of a craft thing, but I've talked to a lot of writers about this, is that when your book demands a lot of research, you can't I think 70% of it has to be chopped out.
Yeah.
When you're actually putting it in the book, into the context, especially in fiction, you don't end up using a huge amount of it.
You have, and along with philosophy, you also have a lot of history. Meera makes, she starts
Especially
teaching
the world
history.
wars,
Yeah, and especially the world wars, and she starts discussing. One of the ways she heals is by discussing history and the world wars with her father, who's a history buff. And I was reading an interview that you did somewhere, and you had said something which I found intriguing. You had said the era we now exist in gives us the most access to nuanced global information that we've ever had. And I think there is a real opportunity to relearn how we've been made to construct our realities. And this sort of deconstruction of our realities is also in a way a deconstruction of the history that has come to us, a reinterpretation of the history that has come to us, and our ways of understandings that have come to us. There's a lovely, one of my favorite scenes in your book is of a young student called Samina who tries to deconstruct the reality of the feminine gender by sort of flashing the class, much to the horror of the principal, and gets Meera fired. But I wanted to ask both of you, and Raj, your book is a deconstruction of a reality that, all of us, this whole country has been living with and trying to heal from over the last, almost a decade, 8 years. So I wanted to ask both of you, how does a novelist deal with history as it exists, as it is interpreted, and as it is unfolding, as it is being made around us?
Like you were saying, like in the last 15 years, what I've seen because of the internet, the information, at least in my worldview, when you're talking about things like gender and mental health and power in a political agency of like where are our resources coming from, who's consuming them the most, and who gets the spotlight on, who gets to say what's right and wrong. I feel like these are things that we have really, like a lot of people have had access to, which we never had in a different way before. And that's creating a lot of chaos, on things like social media and things like that. But we're relearning the work, because when I go back to my school days, I feel like all of what I learned, especially in a sociological context, in history, it was barely carved out when we were learning something. And now when we see it, I really think that this globalization has given us this ability to introspect after you've got a certain level of privilege. And if you have the privilege to sit around and read on the internet, then you have the privilege of kind of introspecting a lot more about what you're consuming and how you're responding to it. But I mean that's my answer to that. But the historical part, that's a great question. I don't know. I was trying to look back at what the recent past, which is why the world wars featured, and there is a mention of a few other things like talked about genocides, because we refer to the Holocaust the most when we talk about genocide, but nobody talks about the Indonesian genocide, for example.
It talks about that?
The Indonesian genocide, for example, because it's not in our collective imagination. And I think so that's what history is, right? History becomes what the majority of our collective imagination is. And when we start to think about the other parts of it, the more disenfranchised parts of it, I don't know, how are we adding to it, how are we retracting from it? I don't have that answer, but that's where I'm interested in looking.
Right. Raj?
I'm not sure about that history. I think history engages with each one of us, not the other way around, because we are part of history, and history engages with us, and the way we define, Rheea, and you will define the rules of engagement with that history in your own way, given who you are and where, and all the things that you believe in or you stand, which will be different from the way I do it, which will be different from the way people in this room do it. So I don't think it is a novelist who engages with history. It is history which engages with us, and we all find our ways to define our rules of engagement in whatever way. Some of us write, some of us work, some of us have jobs in which we engage with history, some of us in our families, some of us in the food we eat. So each one of us find something or a few things which force us to become a part of something larger, which is your relationship with history and the future. We just happen to be people who do it via telling a story. But there are hundreds of ways to engage with history. Yeah. Like we are seeing youngsters doing it now.
Yes. And it's become one of the most contentious subjects, history. But yes, and actually, even to go back to what you said about this access to information and this almost limitless access to information. Another way of looking at it is to say, well, there's so much information and just overflowing like the sea, in fact, just sort of coming and drowning us, that people now find it almost impossible to filter through it all for themselves, and just whoever talks the loudest gets the attention. So would you say that it's also perhaps, or do you think that is part of the storyteller's work is to get to the heart of that information or of the story or what is called the zeitgeist of the moment? Is that something that both of you, either of you, think of?
I mean, I think at best a storyteller, and maybe one of the greatest hopes of storytelling is that the writer can analyze different perspectives, which is something we do not have in this sea of information, because it is very perspective and very polarized driven. So it's like, I am the authority on this, therefore I say this, and you either follow me or you don't and you hate me. And it's the same thing on the other side. But storytelling, like I said, can bring, like you said, the heart of something, and the heart is not perfect. It's bruised and it's black and it's gray and it's got all these colors, and it invites you in, and then like Raj said, it lets you interact with it. That's history interacting with it, because if you get to see a full 360 degrees of this heart, then you make your own interaction with it, instead of saying, I'm accessing this information from such and such person and therefore this is the right thing.
And also, I mean, in the sense that both the books could, especially your book, Raj, if it was non-fiction, it could be a straightforward account, right? And then that would be sort of information or analysis or whatever. But just by telling it as fiction, as a story, something changes.
I think what it does, I think what storytelling, which even in Rhea's book, you can feel that it creates that middle space. Which is now, fortunately or unfortunately, very vacant. There's this huge pressure on each one of us to be on the margins of either the left or the right. It gives you more views, it gives you more likes, it gives you everything. And I think we have abdicated the middle space. A good story forces you to live in that middle space and to make that exciting.
And to engage with it.
If you watch a good movie or a great film or a great story that has touched you, it doesn't matter who the person voted for. It is just a wonderful story. And I think fiction gives you the luxury to create that space where different people act. And we know that in most of our lives we live in that middle space, which is boring, but at the same time that is where most of our life happens.
No, and that middle space, it seems sometimes that it's almost impossible to inhabit anymore. So, there's George Orwell has this lovely essay called Why I Write. And he lists sort of four reasons, four impulses. And the first one is sheer ego. The other is sort of an aesthetic impulse, the desire to record beauty. The third is a historical impulse, that is a desire to record what happened for the future. And fourthly, there is the political impulse. I want to ask you, both of you, in your writing lives, one, do you agree? And second, how do these impulses play out in your writing lives?
I mean, on a certain level, I do agree. I mean, I think there has to be some kind of, I don't know, probably narcissism to think that you have that ability to put something out there and compel others to read it. But I also think then it breaks out into many. I think a writer is someone, and this extends to anyone in a who's an artist or of that sort, and creatively trying to engage. Everybody's a creative person, but when you're creatively engaging with the world, you're compelled to create or be creative in whatever way that is. And I think so that's the heart of a writer, is that even if my book is not getting published or I'm putting something out there, I'll still be compelled to write, and for myself, or just put it out there or just keep it on the side, but I'll be compelled to document, to write. And I think that for me that's one part of it. The second part of it is that somebody was talking about this earlier today, is all writing political? Is it politically driven? And I've had this discussion many times that there's one argument that says, well, writing, everything is political. So my ability to write, how I write, the lens that I'm writing from, my class, my caste, everything is driving to a point of politics. Even if I'm writing about science fiction, there's something still political about the lens that I'm writing within. But then is there a space of you are purposely trying to make a political point, or you're trying to drive a narrative? And for me, I think like how Raj just said, the middle space, and I think the middle space is so important because that's where we're all the most human. We're the most vulnerable, and I think vulnerability at the end of the day is the only thing that allows humans to evolve.
Yeah, that's a lovely answer. Raj,
I completely agree with George Orwell. With whatever George Orwell has said, will write or will ever write, there is no debate. Especially now when we live in very, very Orwellian times. But I think to quote him, to quote George Orwell again, from this wonderful line in 1984, where he says that everybody knows what you're doing. Facebook knows what you're doing, the government knows what you're doing, but what no one knows is what is happening in the few cubic centimeters inside your skull. And I think that is such a powerful line. And for me, writing has been that, can I make that cubic centimeters a few cubic decimeters? Can we get inside the skull? Because governments and companies may know your facts, but they will never know your fiction. And that is your way to resist everything, is can we tell a story that is just inside that skull, which nobody knows. So that's my main impulse. The second is, of course, the second is the more practical one. There is always a gap between what is on the page and what's in your head. All of you, we have felt that. And you write in a bid to narrow that gap. It never narrows. It's my 5th book, and it is more difficult than it ever was.
I cannot say just what I mean.
And so that is also one of the things that makes you turn the page.
And talking of getting into heads, I was reading something, I don't know whether this is true or not, but I was reading something about someone in India who suggested using artificial intelligence in order to create polite and responsible citizenry. So it may not be very far before those inches in our heads are also surveyed. I'm going to open it up to questions, but I'll ask you one last, just to go back to what you said about the middle ground. Things have been changing very fast, both in India and in the world. And of course, as Rheea, you said, everything is political, all of us, in our lives, in our work, in our writings. But the politics is often submerged in a story, or it's subtle, or it comes out, it's nuanced. Is it possible now, do you think, or is it increasingly impossible now for writers and artists to create without an overt political purpose? Do you think it's possible now for writers and artists to create without an overt political purpose, or not have an overt political reaction to the world around
I think
them?
it's certainly possible for more and more people, a large existing people, to create without being aware of a more overt political reality, which has its own place. But I don't know if it's possible for them to, because I think it's still somebody can always access that perspective and say, well, it's political because of this, even if they're the person. So I think it comes down to awareness and why you want to be aware of it. What are your motivations of being aware of it?
No, I think the same. I think the political and the personal deeply intersect each other now, for each one in this room. Even if you don't write, even if you don't read, it does affect. Now, I think when you read, when you decide to spend a couple of hours with a book, I think the question to ask is, does the book help me understand something of that intersection? Now, it doesn't have to be a political book. There may not be a book on the war in Syria, but can a short story affect me that I can understand what a Syrian refugee is going through? Now, I'm just using it as an example. There may not be the great Jamia novel in the next 5 years, but there will be a story, there will be many stories that may tell us a bit about what makes somebody stand up. Now, whether the writer says, I will write about Jamia Nagar in a short story, that is her call. That's a call the writer makes.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm sure there must be many. Oh, there's a hand going up there. The gentleman there at the back.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by cities. Talking of intersectionality, I came to this session to hear as much about the body as the city. Both of you took a step back. Raj, you said that you're agnostic to pin codes. Rheea, you said you've fictionalized your city. And if you just take Nirbhaya's example, what happened to her body that night had Delhi written all over it. It was the confluence of law enforcement, public transport, migration, Delhi's informal economy, slums, everything happening. So consciously or subconsciously, I want to ask, how much did your real or imagined city inscribe itself on your characters? When you're saying you're agnostic or when you're saying you're fictionalizing, what was going through your mind and how did that affect your characters? Thank you.
Sure, I completely agree with you. What took place that night, it took place in Delhi, by definition, and it was as much a product of circumstances. We can play but to me, the story I was telling was more about not so much about, the things you talked about, the political economy, the fact that infrastructure, the fact that there was no safe way for her to go home. That night that she had to board a bus that was virtually empty. There was no subway or a safe system for her to go home. These are very valid stories, but to me the story was more about guilt and the complicity that each one of us has in that. It was more about loss, and so I did not feel the need, to that extent I did not feel the need to specify the city and the streets.
Yeah, and for me, really quickly, it was, you know what, so when I was very acutely aware of this globalized lens that certain sections of people like me, when you live in an Indian city, what do we get access to? Our access is very different from more than 70 to 80% of this country, probably more. But we're the ones who get access to coffee shops and offices and, these other little hidden bubbles. And from that perspective, I feel that all Indian cities are the same. And I think so what happens with my characters is not so much the city, but what access they get. And I think that was something that I was very aware of and trying to, figure out in my head, like where do we close off access to? And how we see a place, how a place becomes home because of these places that we get to.
Any other questions? Oh, there's a lady there.
Hi, I'm Rheea also. This is probably the closest I'm going to get to being on that side of the stage, just hearing my name. My question is to Mr. Jha. I am so curious about so many choices your characters made, but and I could talk for hours about it, but the most important thing for me is to understand why December was the juvenile accused of the rape and nobody else sort of in that entire narrative. And from the character's side as well as from yours, please.
I'm sorry, I didn't get, so you're saying why weren't the other four also in the story?
We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. I understand December's role in the narrative. It was obviously very pivotal. But why was December the kid as opposed to maybe somebody else that was part of the gang?
Why him and not
Why him?
Why
and why
was
not?
I drawn to him?
Clearly he had a story to tell, so maybe that's something that you can speak to. But why, in her imagination, was December the juvenile, or in her hallucination?
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. I think one was the four or the five. The five do come in the book. They're all of them are there. In fact, many of them are named as well. But to me, December was the youngest. He was not an adult at that time. And I was drawn, as I said, and just looking at his backstory, the journey that he had taken, the journey that led him to that night on the bus stop, to me was a story that was so compelling. Also the fact that he was in a large way unformed. That incident forms him. And forever, it changes him forever. He's not the one who's going to hang in the next 8 to 10 days. But in a way, he's going to live with that for as long as he lives. And to me, that seemed to me a better story for me, to tell the larger story of complicity.
Anyone else? There's someone here in the front. There's a gentleman here in the front.
So I have a very basic kind of a question. So how do you break out of class and caste and go into the skin of your character and then, bring that out, bring that voice out and just, not yourself? How do you keep both of the human beings separate despite the fact that you are the creator?
I wish we knew the answer. It is tough. You're very right. You cannot. The simple thing is you cannot, and you do not unpack in that way. But what you do as a storyteller is to work as hard as you can to be accurate and fair to your character. Whether you succeed or not, that's a different thing. But you have to do it real.
I completely agree. I think it's especially the harder it is from your worldview or upbringing, the more you owe it to yourself to be as fair as possible. But it's not something that you know if you're going to do well or not.
I think we have time for one more question. The lady here in the front.
Well, so on a more positive note, while your cities are fictional, I would want to know that what can cities do to make themselves a little more attractive and safe for our citizens and visitors?
I mean, I think it's a sense of ownership and camaraderie that I see lacking in a lot. Like in a city like Bangalore, over the last 10 years, more than 10 years actually, there's been such an influx, but I don't see any subversive ownership. I hear romanticized stories about places like Bombay, but I've never lived in Bombay to come and comment on that. But I hear much better things. And I think it's this sense of community, and I think community can only come from a real sense of appreciation of diversity. And not diversity as a buzzword, but really understanding that people can live in different ways, very different from yours. And that's something I don't think we've all internalized yet. Because once we accept true diversity, I think community is a natural outcome of that, and I think that is really the most positive thing that can happen for a city.
Yeah, when a city secures its public spaces for its most vulnerable, it is a safe city. It becomes a safer city, and that can mean so many things.
I think we are out of time. Thank you very, very much, Raj and Rheea. Thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you very much, Raj Kamal Jha, Rheea Mukherjee and Parvati Sharma. This session was sponsored by Mahindra World City, Jaipur. Also, all three of them will be signing their books at the book signing area on the left of the bar hall. Grab your copies and they'll be right there. We have some very interesting lineup for the music stage tonight at Clark Samer, Parvaz and Abba Hanjura. Grab your tickets from the Jaipur Music Stage box office located at the Center Circle Fountain area at the Diggy Palace ground.